the Cultivating Calmness Podcast. My name is Kaela Vance, and I will be talking today about the representation of therapy in the media, mostly movies and television. And what got me thinking about this was a recent episode of Law and Order SVU that I recently watched. But before I get to that, I just wanted to pose a question for anybody listening. No matter what your career is, how critical are you of the representation of your career when you see it on the big screen, when you see it on TV, in movies, television shows? Are you extra critical of your role, or do you find most of those roles to be accurately portrayed? Are you willing to give a little space in between what they represent and what's real in reality? Or do you find it all to be annoying? I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts. I know as a therapist, I can be a little extra critical and hyper aware of some of the things that are being represented in therapy, especially when there are therapists on the screen behaving in certain ways. So I know I like Law and Order SVU, for example, and it seems pretty accurate to me, but I'm not a police officer, so I don't know what is normal. I don't know what if what's being represented is accurate. I know the timeline, for example, is not accurate just from what I've seen in real life versus what I see on TV. So as a therapist, I tend to be critical of shows when I see them. So that just got me thinking about other professions and how accurate or inaccurate they are when you see them on the screen. So today I wanted to talk about therapy. So, if you've never paid attention, or some of you maybe have, and you've seen therapy portrayed in movies, and you may wonder, is this really what therapy is like? I would say in most cases, they're not always very accurate. Now, that's not to say that there are not accurate portrayals or that they're not very close to accurate portrayals. And I have not seen all of these episodes and all of these shows that I'm going to even talk about today, or that I'm going to bring up. I have seen a decent amount, but in doing some research as I was thinking about talking about this, I realized there are a lot more shows that I haven't seen that portray therapy, psychology, social work, anything along those lines. And they can be like a whole show about it, or they can even just be little snippets and pieces and parts that show up in movies. So what I mentioned today is by no means going to cover everything that's out there. And today I just wanted to focus on the representation of therapists, because there are even more films out there that just represent mental illness, specifically where you may not even have therapy show up in the film or in the movie. It's just the mental illness itself showing up. So that'll be a talk for another day, but today I wanted to just focus on what we see in film. So when it comes to inpatient hospitalization, so psych or psychiatric hospitals, there seem to be quite a few movies out there that represent this. Some are older, some are newer. Some of the ones that I recall and that I found on my list and looking some movies up, one that just personally I remember was Patch Adams. So Patch Adams was about a doctor who's a real life doctor now. I'm not sure if he's still alive now or not, but before he started out, he was very depressed and in psychiatric hospitals, and there are several scenes of him interacting with other patients within a psychiatric hospital. And from my recollections, I feel like that was a fairly accurate representation of what a psychiatric hospital may have been like back when this took place, which I believe was the 70s. I could be wrong about the timing there. So psychiatric hospitals have changed a lot from, the mid 1900s to now, but we hope that they have improved. but for the most part, when I see those in films, they tend to be fairly accurate. Now, when we talk about like interactions that doctors or therapists may have with their patients in those settings, they may or may not be fully accurate. And a lot of times what I mean by accurate is like when they depict a therapist disclosing like personal information, or maybe a therapist or psychiatrist or doctor going maybe above and beyond, going steps further, like you meeting them outside of the office, or meeting them, taking them home, or inviting people into the office that normally wouldn't happen, or having maybe a more personal relationship, which is never okay in therapy world, with a patient. So those things would all be more inaccurate representations. Another film, which was an older one, was One That Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which takes place in a psychiatric hospital. And the consensus, I believe, is that it was a fairly accurate representation, and it kind of disagreed with how patients and therapists would bribe therapists or staff members to get things or do things, and the consensus seemed to be like that would never happen. And I would like to say that would never happen, although I've worked in one psychiatric hospital, and I don't believe that happened in the hospital that I worked at, but I was one person. I believe that could happen. I believe that could happen in any situation, in any job. So as far as like whether that is accurate, I believe it could happen. I don't know that I've seen it personally happen, but it's a possibility. So whether you take that to be accurate or inaccurate, that's up to you. If you are somebody who has experienced that or witnessed that in a hospital setting, please let me know. I'd be interested to hear about that. Some other representations when I think about in film, not TV shows, I'll get to that in a minute, would be like Good Will Hunting. That's a pretty popular one, where, and I don't have all the characters' names, but there was the student. He actually wasn't a student until he was caught, finishing a math problem on the board that nobody else could figure out. And then they had him go see the psychologist, who was played by Robin Williams, and it kind of goes through their relationship together and how he gets Will to speak and share some of his inner thoughts and experiences and form relationships and make his own decisions. And I thought that was a pretty accurate depiction of therapy, and showed Robin Williams' character divulging some personal experiences. So there's some differing perspectives on whether therapists should or should not do that. In my experience and in what I've learned and in talking with other therapists, we want to do that sparingly, and we want to do that when it benefits the client. So if you ever see that in a movie or a show, self-disclosure is not meant to be something that's a regular occurrence in therapy. And there are varying arrays of self-disclosure, like, oh yeah, my favorite color is green, could be considered a self-disclosure. Or yeah, I fight with my husband too, would be a version of self-disclosure, and that would, I would deem that to be a little more intimate than your favorite color. And some therapists go deeper than that, some don't. Some offer no self-disclosures, some offer maybe a lot of self-disclosure. Ultimately, the thought is that we want to offer self-disclosure when it benefits the client, not when it benefits us. So if we feel like, oh, I just want to share this, well, is that benefiting the person I'm speaking to? Are they going to get something out of that is going to help them? Or is this really just to benefit me and get it off my chest? then it's not considered to be beneficial. So if you see that represented in film, that may be the question to ask. And if you're seeing these representations, I guess the big reason I bring this up is, if I was not a therapist and I was wanting to see a therapist and I saw therapy represented in some of these films, I might be afraid to go to therapy thinking, oh my gosh, is this what therapy is really going to be like? Is this, how it really happens? Because I don't want any part of that. So for the good representations, absolutely, I'd want something like that. So let me see. There's some other really good films, some that are meant to be obviously comedic, meaning like everything you're seeing is being played up and embellished, and hopefully you understand that that isn't real. In other instances, maybe it's not really clear whether this really would happen or really wouldn't happen. So Shrink is one. I remember seeing that. It's been a while since I've seen Shrink, but I think that was a mix of good and bad. The King's Speech shows the King George going to see a speech therapist. Now, not exactly therapy, but going to help him be able to speak well. And I think that was a pretty good representation of getting him to be able to overcome certain difficulties that he was facing. The Departed is a movie that has been, was a highly proclaimed video or a film, but the therapist in it has been very highly criticized, or the representation of the therapy has been very highly criticized because a lot of the things that she did in the film were not accurate representations and things that would probably never happen in real life. Another one that's a comedy, actually the next couple are comedies, so they're meant to be, embellished, but Prime. So Prime had, the main characters were Uma Thurman and Meryl Streep. Meryl Streep is the therapist, and Uma Thurman is going to see her, so she's the client. And at first, everything's going well, and then the therapist, Meryl Streep's character, realizes that Uma Thurman's character is dating Meryl Streep's son. So this would never happen in real life, or if it did happen in real life, there would have to be a therapist would likely break off connection with that client and try to find them a new therapist because that would be a conflict of interest. And you can see that in the film because she gets very uncomfortable and starts making, recommendations or saying things that she wouldn't normally say because she realizes that the person she's talking about, that Uma is coming to complain about, is actually her son. So this would, if it did happen in real life, the therapist ethically should disclose this information to the client and then find a new therapist or help them find a new therapist, because they would not be able to practice good judgment. They would not be able to come from a unbiased perspective in that situation, and that would be what would happen in real life. And then What About Bob is a comedy, and I believe it's about a client that stalks his therapist. Now, I haven't actually seen that one, but being a comedy and somebody stalking, their therapist, now I can say that I've heard examples of this happening in real life, and so that would be pretty scary if you've ever been a victim of stalking. So if this were to happen in real life, that would be scary, and there would be things that you would need to do, but this is a comedy, so it's made light of. But in general, when things are comedic in nature, they're not portrayed as being very accurate. So then if we go to some of the TV shows, television shows, again, there's lots out there. I'm only touching on a few, and some are like how they're represented in film and TV. And the ones I'm mentioning are actually shows that are mostly all about therapy. There's untold amounts of episodes within TV where there may be a snippet, a scene involving a therapist, and whether that is portrayed accurately or not, we won't get into that today, except to talk about, which I mentioned in the beginning, why I wanted to talk about this, which was I saw an episode of Law and Order SVU. It's probably been 3 weeks now, and it was the very first. It opened up to this scene of 𝗓𝗂𝗏𝗏𝗧𝗏's character seeing a therapist, trying to talk about a recent incident where she saw a future victim, not knowing it was going to be a victim, and then kind of beating herself up about it and kind of being traumatized by this. So she goes to see an EMDR therapist, and as an EMDR therapist, I was very critical of how she was portraying EMDR. I did not like it, but some may do EMDR different than me, and that's totally okay. But then the biggest piece was that at the end of the session, the 𝗓𝗏𝗏𝗏 walks out, goes to leave, and the therapist stops her to ask her, or tell her actually, about another client of hers, and to basically get her opinion and perspective, because 𝗓𝗏𝗏𝗏 is an NYPD SVU officer. And instead of reporting this to Children's Services, she should have reported a rape or an assault to Children's Services. She was telling her other patient about another patient, which would or should never happen in real life. And then not only does she tell her about what's going on, then she discloses who this person is to her other client, 𝗓𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏. And that's just completely and utterly wrong and would never happen in real life, and then later on they show the other patient scared because she wasn't supposed to say that, and I didn't think that this would ever come out, and I didn't think they'd ever find out. Yeah, they shouldn't have found out that way. So I would be scared off for life from therapy if that ever happened to me in real life. So hopefully if you saw that episode, that's not something that you think would happen in real life. It definitely shouldn't. Should the therapist have shared this information with Children's Services, and maybe all this information would have come out that way? Yes, that's how it should have happened, not the way that it did happen. But there are a couple of really good shows about the show therapy. One of them is called In Treatment. I actually watched this and found this when I was in grad school, and in wanting to talk about this, I realized there's a whole other season that was not out when I first saw it. So it was a decade later, they created a whole nother season of this show, and it depicts a therapist talking to different clients each day of the week. And so what I thought was really cool is, we talked to client A on Monday, client B on Tuesday, and it just was really showing him and his interactions with each of these clients, and you got to see them go through progress in therapy. And then at the end of the week, he would meet with his therapist for what we call supervision, to talk about these clients and his interactions with them, and if he's doing everything right, and also his life, and a little bit about how he's managing his life and those of his clients. And so each week you would walk through the different sessions with these people, and kind of watch their progress or lack of progress and his skill as a therapist. So I really liked watching it. I thought that it showed his skill as a therapist was really good, and some of those interactions, there were some points in time where he had some unethical interactions and some things he maybe shouldn't have been doing, but overall I thought it was a really good depiction of how therapy should be in shows. So if you're interested, I would really check out In Treatment. Excuse me. I have not seen this one, but I saw several reviews on this one. It's called Couples Therapy. And so this is actually supposed to be, this is an unscripted, recorded for TV, real couples therapy. So these are real couples receiving real therapy with hidden cameras around a therapy office, where these clients apparently agreed to be on the show and to do this and work through therapy. So I have not seen it, but I'm very interested, and that might be a show that I may be watching soon, but I hear that it is pretty good, being that it is a real therapist and real couples. However, I don't know exactly how accurate it is. I hear it's pretty good. Then there are, one that I recently saw was Shrinking, and that's on Apple TV. And although it is hilarious, it is full of inaccuracies and things that would never ever happen. There are accuracies. I do like how some of the therapy sessions happen and some of the things that are talked about, but the self-disclosure is pretty inaccurate. And the biggest piece, and this would be a spoiler alert, that he ends up, he meets a lot of his clients out in public, which it depends. Some therapists do that, like walk and talk therapy, or exposure therapy. Like there's different types of therapy where that would be more accurate. But just to do it on a whim, not usually seen as being accurate. And then he then invites a client to live in his like back house, his extra house in his backyard. Which would never happen. So although it makes for a great story and it's funny, and I really like the show, not a very accurate representation of therapy and how the therapy world works, but still a really good show. Some other shows, one that actually was a surprise to me, I've never seen the show Sopranos, so I had no idea that Sopranos depicted psychotherapy. Well, it does, and that seems to be a big basis of the show. And so when I was looking up some good shows on top of the ones that I already was aware of, this was one that kept popping up over and over again. So it seems to, depict the main character going to therapy to work through some of the issues that go on within the show, and whether that's an accurate or inaccurate depiction, I'll leave that up to you. Some other ones that you may have heard of would be the United States of Tara. Now that one is more focused on a specific diagnosis, which is DID, dissociative identity disorder, and not necessarily the focus on therapy. And then Private Practice, that's what it's called, and I believe that's on Hulu, is another show about therapy practice. So these are all different shows that you may consider seeing, or maybe you have seen. Again, this is just a small handful of the shows that are out there, but my biggest thing with all of these is that they can really, bring out the worst in maybe us therapists when we watch them, because we sit here and we critique them. Oh, this would happen. Oh, this wouldn't happen. Or, oh yeah, that medication, or no, that medication, not that. And, oh, how could they do that? And so we can be really, protective of our careers and what we do, and we don't really want it portrayed inaccurately, as I'm sure most of you who are out there don't want your roles portrayed inaccurately. And so if that is you, it's just something I thought would be unique to talk about and think about, is how our careers are portrayed, what we think about them, whether it's right or wrong, and whether we're okay with it or not okay with it. And future topic of discussion will be some of those other shows that talk about mental health, or just represent or show mental health in the films versus the therapists themselves. So we could talk probably about that for an hour on that episode. So we'll see, that one may be coming up soon. Thank you for joining me today. Feel free to share with me your thoughts on therapy represented in film and TV, and I will see you next week.